Very much, Lawrence, for coming to the CASI Forum on African sustainability and helping us to moderate a session on carbon markets. I think it generated a lot of ideas. And personally, I'm spending a lot of time on carbon market related issues, including recently I was asked by UNCTAD to do a research paper for G20 discussion on how to improve the role of voluntary carbon markets, especially for emerging markets, developing countries, harmonizing standards and enhancing credibility, improving interconnectivity, and so on. So I'd like to really pick your brain on some of the issues which you are now doing research on. One of them is the interoperability. I actually asked you the question during the session. There are lots of VCM popping up, and you said it's 37. Yes, and at least in Asia, I saw like 5 or 6, which I convened last year, in Africa and Middle East, Latin America. All of them are very nascent. They're small, illiquid, and they don't have much interconnectivity in terms of standards. They all look different, and investors are uncomfortable, reading in local language the standards, and therefore the access and liquidity are all very limited. So what do we do to really improve the interoperability of these markets so that we can generate more cross-border flows to the market that's needed, the financing?
I think one of the first things that needs to come in and that we're seeing evolving is like a common standard for quality in carbon credits. So as I said, there are multiple carbon standards with multiple different methodologies, and they don't equate. And buyers and investors are viewing these differently. There's premiums on some standards over others, and some standards are favored for some technologies and not others. We kind of need a common standard so that a buyer can make an informed decision based on adherence to a particular standard rather than having to go through the complex process of understanding all those standards. So the work that the ICVCM is doing in creating core carbon principles will be a great advance in that, because a buyer will be able to rely on their due diligence in doing his buying rather than his own due diligence comparing different standards and different methodologies. So that's one thing that's there. Ultimately, I'm hopeful that Article 6.4, which is the UN mechanism under the Paris Agreement to create an international carbon market, will raise the bar and basically create the internationally accepted standard of what is a quality carbon credit. I think that will go a long way. And even if the other standards still remain in place, they will have a bar to be measured against. And I think that will help greatly.
Yeah, just to echo your point, I actually was sitting on the board of ICVCM for 3 years, and I just retired. I'm now sitting on the so-called Distinguished Advisory Board. So I went through the process of ICVCM developing the core carbon principle, endorsing some of the crediting programs such as Gold Standard and Vera, and now they are sort of endorsing some of the methodologies under these ICVCM aligned standards. I think this is a great job which needs to be expanded to cover more voluntary carbon markets. Now, the problem is that the ICVCM remains a NGO, which is considered as a private sector-led effort, and trying to push this into the G20. If G20 can endorse ICVCM as having the potential to become a global baseline for VCM standard, I think it's going to go a long way to enhance interoperability of different market standards. Now, a related question is what you mentioned, Article 6.4, eventually may also offer a platform for harmonizing standards. Now, how do we go about this ICVCM core carbon principle vis-a-vis Article 6.4? How do they align?
I think ICVCM is, I mean, they live independently, but ICVCM will be looking at the methodologies that are going to be implemented by Article 6.4 to assess them against their framework. So Martin, yeah, I think the ICVCM has done some fantastic work on assessing the environmental integrity of the standards and the methodologies. And that work, if it was adopted by Article 6.4, would go a long way in creating an international standard of high quality credits.
Great. Now let's move on to the second topic, which is the cross-border VCM flows. Under Article 6, there's some bilateral agreements already, for example, between Singapore and some of the low-income countries, between the Northern European countries and some African countries. I think it's great. It's benefiting a few African countries already. But this is not done on a large scale yet. And we need to overcome some challenges. For example, some market participants, including investors, are concerned about the need for corresponding adjustment, and they don't know how to do that. And some countries don't have the mechanism registers in place, and others are waiting for the government to create these bilateral, agreements. So how do we promote the usage of Article 6 so that we can generate more really flow of funds into the carbon credit projects in developing countries, low-income countries?
I think you hit on a very good point. I mean, institutional and administrative capacity in African governments has been a challenge in many quarters, and I think that was one of the issues that resulted in a very, very low participation by African countries in the clean development mechanism. And the bar for participating under Article 6 is considerably higher than it was under the clean development mechanism. Capacity building is where it is desperately needed. But what is great to see is the number of international agencies which are assisting African governments in developing their frameworks, in developing their mechanisms for registering credits under Article 6. And this is badly needed because the Article 6 is a challenging environment. There's a lot that needs to be put in place for an African country to participate. They have to measure their own economy-wide emissions to work out what sectors to focus on. They have to cost those emissions and work out which ones it makes sense to export and which ones it makes sense to retain in country to meet their own NDCs. So this is a Herculean effort for African countries to get up the curve so that they can comply with the requirements of the UNFCCC under Article 6. But we are seeing great progress. Ghana is leading the charge in relation to Article 6 on the continent. And in the last week, the Carbon Market Office in Ghana published a report showing that they've managed to generate hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment in their projects. Those projects going into the private sector, some portion to the government, developing that industry in Ghana. And I think nothing works better than seeing your neighbors do well. Mm-hmm. And I think African countries will look at Ghana and see that it can be done, and that will hopefully spur them to get across the line and make sure they can participate in this market.
Definitely. I think there's a lot of inspiration from Ghana's case, for the neighboring countries and also for some Asian, small island countries. Yeah. Now, switching to the topic of costs, a lot of complaints about the VCM markets are not necessarily benefiting the local communities where the carbon credit projects, are located, and a large part of the money that's made by the carbon credits go into the consultants, for verification, validation, and going through all the very complex procedures for registration and so on and so forth. And of course, there are solutions. For example, technology, right? Blockchain-based, trading, data collection, verification, and so on and so forth. So how much of the potential of technology in really reducing the cost and leaving more benefits to the local community?
Yeah, I think there's a huge role for technology here, and you're touching on blockchain, and we're seeing the digitization of methodologies, and we're seeing blockchain being used to trace payments and the involvement of the communities, and making sure that we've got traceability on payments being made to communities, and it's not just a statement, it is actually verifiable that communities are benefiting. I think that's a really important element to bring in the investors so that they can see that the money that they're putting in is going into the communities that they need to see. The digitization of methodologies and other mechanisms to improve sort of the administrative side of it is really needed. In Africa, we don't have any verification bodies. If you need to get a project audited in Africa, you're going to fly somebody in, and the cost of that can be prohibitive. The costs of getting the consultants in can be prohibitive. We kind of need African-friendly standards and African-friendly methodologies that that are adapted for the African context. And we need to train up and have a pool of verifying bodies that can basically be local and not charge a fortune for coming to do a relatively straightforward job. The other place where technology can play a significant role is actually in the monitoring and verification. The price or the value of a carbon credit is directly related to the perceived quality of that credit. And when we say quality, what we mean is how certain are you that that credit represents the absence of 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere. The more technology we can bring in to demonstrate the quality and the fact that of these carbon credits, to demonstrate that the cook stove has actually been used, the trees have actually grown, and then the higher quality, those credits are going to be higher quality and attract a higher price. I think the return on that technology investment is going to be well worth it, because buyers are really understanding now that quality is an important thing for them. They have to defend it to their stakeholders. They have to defend to their stakeholders the credits that they buy, so they need to be able to show that they've had the environmental impact that they say they have.
Final question on capacity building. You touched upon some capacity issues, right, in terms of VVB and so on, but there are a lot of capacity constraints in the voluntary carbon market, especially in developing country. I think from standard setting body, they need to understand what are the international best practices on the validation, verification part, and on a lot of market participants in terms of how to identify the good projects and how to incubate the design of projects. And CASI is a platform to provide capacity building services on a range of sustainable finance issues, including carbon markets. Any advice you have for us, CASI, to provide sort of more useful sort of training for the carbon market related players?
I think engaging with governments is key. So regulation is really important. When we're looking at different carbon markets, one of the key determinants of whether we're comfortable investing in those markets is the regulatory infrastructure. And that is where I think we need to spend a lot of time doing the capacity building with governments to help them put the right regulatory infrastructure, to help them put the right sort of authorization infrastructure in for Article 6. But I think what we mustn't lose sight of is that Article 6 is still a nascent mechanism. And there are only a few buyer countries. This is a buyer's market currently. And one of the things we have to be careful is to make sure that the regulatory environment that is put in place is investor friendly, because these African countries are trying to attract that investment from a few buyer countries right now. Placing opaque regulations in place or difficult fiscal regimes are going to deter the investment in their countries. And I think they have to understand that right now it is a buyer's market. As we scale up, it'll change, but right now it's a buyer's market.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for your time. I think this conversation will be very useful for our audience who are interested in carbon markets.
Thank you very much, Roger.